So my name is Samantha Sutherland. I'm the moderator for today's conversation, and I also host Work 180's podcast, Equality Talks. So if you're looking for some isolation entertainment, then check out our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Equality Talks. The latest episode is actually about managing mental health, which is really important during this time. And the next one is going to be around specifics around remote working and how you can make that better for your team. Then if I can introduce Gemma Lloyd, she's CEO and co-founder of Work 180. After experiencing discrimination at work in the tech industry, Gemma wanted to flip the job seeking model on its head and give power back to job seekers. She is in the process of changing the world, and I'm so excited to be part of her mission. So hi, Gemma. And then we have Valeria Ignatieva, who is the other CEO and co-founder of Work 180. And so while she was raising a son with special needs as a single mother, Valeria knows firsthand how important flexibility and support from your employer are to having a successful career whilst managing a family. She is so passionate about the success of every single one of our candidates and has a wealth of knowledge and stories about everybody. And I'm so excited to be talking to you again tonight. So welcome to both of you. So we're going to dive right into some of the questions. So Gemma, if I can start with you. So if you can kind of first set the scene, explain how Work 180 operates and why you two are specialists in managing a remote team. So why should people listen to you?
Sure, thank you, Sam. Well, Work 180 has been around for coming up to 6 years now. And in that entire time, we have 100% always worked remotely. We've got around 40 people now, and they're spread across Australia, the UK, and the US. So I think it's fair to say, you know, with 6 years kind of under our belt, we're pretty good at it.
Great, thanks. Valeria, if I can swap to you, can you share what some of the biggest positives are with remote working?
Sure, and hi everyone. Nice to see some people on video as well, all the way across the world. For me, I think if I look at productivity gains that we can all make when people work remotely and flexibly in a way that suits them, they're incredible. So, you know, you will be able to access productivity from your employees that you may have never experienced previously if the other, tools are set up properly and there's lots of collaboration and feedback going on, because ultimately, you know, having worked remotely prior to Work 180 myself for nearly 10 years, so a total of over 15 years, I've seen a lot of different things in the collaboration space become released over the last few years that make it, you know, possible to be quite seamless in terms of, you know, working remotely and being super productive. And if you do decide to continue to work remotely after this pandemic is over, there's also the added benefit of actually being able to tap into talent which you may have previously been unable to reach. When I think of, you know, the number of women that have gotten jobs through Work 180 with supportive employers that have worked in, you know, lived in really remote locations, for example, they wouldn't have been able to access those women. Often they're women in leadership as well, if it wasn't for remote working. So I think, you know, the benefits that we can gain right now and also following the pandemic are quite extensive.
And what have been some of the biggest challenges around managing a remote team?
Well, if I look back on, you know, again, the types of tools that we have now are amazing. When I was working remotely about 15 years ago, we had email to communicate on, and that was it. And that was really cumbersome and slow. So, you know, the challenges as we all mobilize our workforces now is to make sure that they're set up for success, you know, not only just the hardware, but also all the tools that they need, especially around, you know, we've got UX teams, for example, that are working with our customers and teams internally, and thinking about things that could replace their whiteboard sessions, for example, and other, you know, real-time communication tools such as Slack and Microsoft Teams and so on. They're super important. So it is going to be challenging if you don't set those up. And the other big part, obviously there's a lot more, but the other big standout for me is that continuous feedback loop. So, you know, asking your teams how they're finding this new, you know, environment, asking them whether they have everything that they need, whether or not they understand, you know, they're clear on their objectives and so on, and making sure that the feedback's flowing through, you know, both from you to them and from them to you and across teams and so on, because it's all, you know, new to a lot of people, and we can't improve unless we drive this culture of, you know, really, really open feedback.
Yeah. So in the podcast that I mentioned earlier, the woman that I interviewed for that, who's a specialist in remote working, said that one of the big challenges with early setup of remote teams is managing meetings and how you make them useful and meaningful and productive. And we actually had a session on that at Work 180 today. So Gemma, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like the key things for making meetings useful and productive when you're working with a remote team.
Yeah. Funnily enough, as Sam said, did run that session internally today, because I think the key is with remote working or really any type of working, but specifically definitely remote, is that continuous improvement piece. So consistently reassessing, is this working and what can we do a little bit better? And since the pandemic has hit, we've noticed that we do need to improve things a little bit to make sure all of our employees are supported. And so with the effective communication, it came down to really a couple of things. So the first is, what are your channels and how are you using each of those channels? So for instance, we've got Slack, which is more your asynchronous communication chat, but messages do get lost in there. So, but that's our primary source of communication. Emails, web conferences, and then finally the meeting, which does it really need to be a meeting, was a big topic of discussion today. So I think with managing a remote workforce, what's worked really, really well is the cadence of meetings, how often we're having them, and having very, very clear objectives for each of those and time limits for each of those. Not disregarding the personal touch that needs to happen. When you jump on a web conference, it's exactly the same as when you greet somebody in person. You know, it's really important that we still have that human touch with how is everybody, how's it going, which is easy to get lost, but then being very clear. And then the guidance that I actually gave my team as well was around when you're communicating, be succinct, simplify your point, kind of, I said it in a much kinder way, but let's not waffle. And if it's not on the meeting agenda, let's not talk about it right now. So with the pandemic, people have kids at home, you know, they've got partners at home. They're a lot busier than they used to be. So our productivity needs to increase dramatically. So meeting cadence and outcomes is super, super important. And then the other thing is really, really clear expectations and KPIs as a manager. However you manage teams before, it's almost like we all need to really, really level up and do those things that we know we should have been doing all the time, but it's extra, extra important now. We don't want to be micromanaging teams. We don't want to be constantly checking up on them. So if you set really clear expectations and those KPIs, then things can run very, very smoothly, and have a tool to be able to collaborate and see those. Like Trello, for example, is a fantastic project management tool, and a way you can keep track of tasks without the need to be checking in on people all the time.
Yeah, thanks. So my next question, which you kind of have half answered, I think, is if you could give 1 or 2 tips to managers who are now looking after a remote team, what would you say to them? So you talked about having really clear expectations and KPIs. Is there anything else that you would suggest to a manager who's looking after a remote team now to make it as successful as possible?
Yeah, aside from those things that I've already said, empathy and building trust. Empathy is so important at this time because we don't know what's going on at home with our teams, you know, right off the bat. So, you know, we have to understand that there are distractions around for meetings. There are also meeting times which might not work for people. So actually, if you have trust with your team and you have that open level of communication, they can be, you know, there was a team member of ours who we didn't realize was a single mum with a couple of kids at home that was really, really struggling with the number of meetings with her kid, being able to manage her kids. And as soon as that was kind of laid out on the table and we were made aware of that, we were able to kind of rejig things to support her even more, because it's, at the end of the day, it's about her outputs and how can we make sure she's not stressed out so she's still able to deliver on the work.
Yeah, because on the kids, you know, if you're trying to keep them quiet so you can attend a lot of meetings, you can't keep them quiet to actually do the work. And so on that, actually, we're doing another webinar, which is on managing working from home with kids, because that's a big difference to how people have been working from home previously. So Valeria, if I can go back to you, what's the most surprising thing you've learned so far managing a remote team?
So I think for me, the most surprising thing is when I talk to new starters, say a week or two in, that have joined our team, and 9 times out of 10, they've come from an environment where they've gone into an office on a very regular basis. So it's their first ever remote stint. And most people, like literally 99% of the feedback that I usually get is that they feel more connected with their team remotely than they have previously in an office. And that is incredible, you know. So we then dig deeper around, because, you know, we're very close to this. We've been doing it for so long, and it's really, really good to get that insight from somebody new coming into the business. So when we dig deeper, we ask things like, you know, what do you think has contributed to this, and so on. And some of the, again, the feedback there is our system, I guess, for staying connected outside of just the work, business as usual types of meetings is very healthy, in the sense of, you know, if I give you some examples, on Slack we have channels such as a water cooler channel where people can have a chat. There's a pets channel, there is a plants channel, there's a kids, I just found out there was a parenting channel that I kind of, well, my son's all grown up, but I joined it anyway and had a bit of a chuckle at some of the stuff that people are sharing. There's lots of other different channels where people connect on topics that they have in common. And that builds, like, you know, Gemma spoke earlier about trust and empathy. That really builds that connection between teammates, so that when there is any kind of difficult situations, or, you know, you need to collaborate over something, they're much closer than before. Obviously, you know, we don't have the physical drinks that we might be used to in an office. We actually have virtual drinks now. We also celebrate the wins, which is really important at a time like this. And I'm really pleased to say, you know, we had a team from Australia and the UK join our weekly team success call. And in the last 3 weeks, it's been the highest attendance that I've ever seen, and also the most wins. So people are celebrating small things, big things. And I think, you know, you've really got to maintain that glass half full attitude, especially at a time like this. And we do find that, you know, having those extra connection sessions has really made an impact. There's also a tool called Donut, which plugs into Slack and can pair up different team members from, you know, across departments, across the world, and actually facilitate a catch up between them for half an hour. And that's wonderful. You know, I saw somebody from the UK the other day catching up with somebody in the tech team. They wouldn't normally, you know, work together, but there's often, you know, questions that they might have for each other, and they're brought a lot closer through those types of connections.
Yeah, I love the donut catch-ups, and do them all, like, as almost everyone that I've been paired up with have done, because, yeah, I'm really extroverted, and it's a great way to create connection with people when you're at work. So both of you have discussed a little bit and kind of alluded to trust and building trust with your teams. And so, Gemma, I want to ask you, successfully managing a remote team does rely on having enough trust in your team to not try and micromanage them, especially when it's basically impossible when you're not in the office with them. But what would you suggest to somebody who's trying to build trust with their team and make sure that they feel comfortable, that they know what's going on enough that they can let go a little bit? What would you suggest to people in that position?
Well, I guess there's two things that are going on at the moment. The first thing is that people are going to be worried, actually, generally about their jobs and the climate. So you'll probably find, to an extent, that people will be more switched on now than they were before. But on the flip side of that, they also may have things dealing with at home. So as a leader, it goes back to what I was saying earlier around setting the expectations, managing the KPIs. And if that person is unable to meet those, you've got to have a really open and honest discussion around what's going on, you know, and what's going on at home, and how can I support you more to be able to achieve these particular things. Using tools like the Trello that I mentioned is a really good way, because, you know, I think in the early days when we were remote working, I found myself actually quite anxious a lot of the time around, is this piece of work getting done? Should I just check in and find out? And, you know, if you have the right tools in place and your expectations are clear, you really don't need to do all of those things. So, you know, SharePoint or Google Drive, whatever it might be. Also, we have like weekly meetings where at the beginning of the week we have our number one priorities, and then we discuss actually where those have achieved sort of the next the next week. And then there are daily stand-ups. It's usually like 15-minute stand-ups between each team. And in that stand-up, it's an open forum to discuss what challenges or blockers that person may be having that particular day. So going back to the structure, and also what Valeria was saying around making people very comfortable to be able to give feedback as well, and actually proactively asking for feedback. Is this working for you? Am I supporting you enough? Is there anything that I can do better as a leader to be able to enable you to get your job? So do your job. Those types of things I think are really important.
Mm. And what would you recommend for somebody who has someone with performance issues in their team now that everybody's remote? Because again, it's more complicated than it previously was, both in physical distance and in a lot of external stuff going on.
Yeah. You've got to be fair and reasonable. You know, if there are performance issues and the person hasn't usually had performance issues, then obviously, like I've said a million times, you know, the empathy piece, reassessing KPIs, seeing if there's reasonable adjustments that you can make to ensure that they can achieve those. But also at the end of the day, productivity, particularly during this time, is very important for a business, because business are about to survive 12, 18, potentially 24 months of economic challenges. So people in your team need to be reliant on each other and pulling their weight. So one of the things that I found has worked really, really well is when you talk to a team about the bigger part that they play. And, you know, they're one piece of a puzzle, a very important piece, but one piece of this puzzle that we all need to work together. We all need to fit together for us all to get through this economic downturn together. This is about not just you, this is about your colleagues and your colleagues' families, and what's that bigger picture. So that's kind of, I think, with Work 180, our mission is so strong, you know, around empowering women, that we find that we don't have too much trouble kind of getting people motivated because they believe so much in that bigger picture. So it's just finding that bigger picture, I think, for people to be a part of.
Yeah. So Valeria, how do you keep remote teams connected? And particularly when everybody's in a real transition period right now, what would you recommend people focus on to ensure that teams remain connected and productive through all this change?
Sure. So, you know, I mentioned the kind of extracurriculum channels earlier on. So that's keeping people connected on that team camaraderie level. In terms of business as usual, you know, Gemma mentioned regular check-ins, which are very important, even if it's just a quick stand-up at the beginning of every day, just so that people can align their goals. They can also, you know, perhaps call out areas where they're struggling. And people can jump in with suggestions. I find that really helpful. The other thing that we use to share knowledge is, it's called Nuclino, and it's basically like an internal wiki where you can create, it's really, really easy to administer. Anyone can jump in and add content where, you know, you might have your sales team collaborating on different strategies for clients. You might have your customer success teams. You might have your product teams that are posting, you know, recordings of the calls that they had with their product updates. And, you know, in that case, if somebody couldn't make the call because they had children, for example, at that point in time, they could watch a recording at a time that suits them. So it's about how do you make sure that everyone stays connected, that has the information that they need without, you know, being in that office environment and being able to come up and tap somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, what happened in the meeting yesterday? Because, you know, you've got to remember that it's, again, all very new to people, and they might be hesitant to pick up the phone and call out or call their manager because they don't want to seem like they're not keeping up, so to speak. So it's about making it really easy for people to find all that information. And, you know, as we keep saying, it's about that feedback loop as well. So do you have everything that you need? And you'll find that people are quite forthcoming. They might say, you know, I don't know where to look for this particular piece of information, and then you can decide on how best to share that and make sure that that's also kept live and updated, because who knows how long we'll be in this position for, where you really need to have that clear repository of you know, where everything is stored centrally.
Mm. Another interesting conversation I had with someone recently was around the fact that we know that culture is really hard to shift once it's embedded. And in this period right now, we actually have the chance to shape the connection of our team and the way that we interact with each other in a way that in a month's time, it gets much harder to change, because if people are used to just emailing each other and having no other connection, then it gets harder to bring people together and get them on video calls and stuff like that. So there is a moment now to think about what do I want this to look like in 2 months' time if we're still working at home, or 6 months' time if we're still working at home, and really focus on creating that. I'm about to ask Valeria and Gemma the last question that I've got for each of them. So if you are on the call and you have a question that you would like to ask, please feel free to start popping that into the chat box, and we'll go to those questions after we finish this last question that I have for each of them. So I'm going to ask both of you the same question. So we'll start with you, Gemma. If you could go back in time to the start of Work 180, almost 6 years ago, what would you say to young Gemma about how to make remote working as successful as possible for the team?
Okay, so aside from all the things I've already said, the other thing I'd probably say is to make it known to the team, just because I'm sending you something now on Slack, don't feel like you need to reply straight away. So when you set up a remote team, you'll set up often quite some type of chat communication, very, very distracting during the day. And so I think it's really important to set those guidelines of, don't need to get back to this right away. And also blocking out time in my own diary as well for what I call deep work. When you're remote, people can't see what you're doing, can't see what you're working on. So it's very easy to pick up the phone and call, to block out a million meetings in your diary. So, as a manager, to be your best self, you need to look after yourself as well. And how are you making sure that you've got set times to get the really important work done, and not just responding on chat, and vice versa.
Yeah, Valeria mentioned that in another call too, that early on she would just accept any meeting that anybody said at any time, and you can't work in 20-minute pockets between meetings. You need to actually have time to dive into it. So V, if I can pose the same question to you, if you could go back in time 6 years ago to younger Valeria, what would you say to her about setting things up so it would be as successful as possible?
Definitely don't take as long as I did to take control of my diary, because it was, just a dog's breakfast until not that long ago. And I mean, tonight, for example, I'll be going to bed fairly early because Tuesdays and Wednesdays I need to get up from 4 a.m. To have meetings with our US employers and so on. So I'm getting into this routine instead of just accepting, calls at any given moment. I've really took my diary, and I'm actually quite excited because I was reading a book over the weekend where one of the tricks that they recommend for productivity is figure out what we should all know what our number one goals are, but imagine setting aside, you start with half an hour every morning before everyone starts smashing your phone and inbox with requests and all sorts of things, setting aside half an hour to focus just on that number one goal. And the idea is to stretch it out to 2 hours. So if anyone's ever worked, on the weekend or after hours uninterrupted, I'm sure you know what I mean by exactly how much you can get accomplished in the space of just a couple of hours that could take you all week, with all the procrastinating, with the distractions and so on, to not even complete. So I'm going to be doing that as well. And I guess, I wish I'd known earlier that we have so many hours in a week, but you can be really clever with how you use that time instead of just kind of going along with the flow. So that's my biggest learning, I'd say.
Yeah, nice. So we have some questions coming in the chat, which is great. So I'll read them out, and if people want to be unmuted to discuss it more, then we can do that too. So Rachel has said that she has a member of her team who works excessive hours, who says it's because they like work. It's not due to their workload. It's always been a problem, but it's now more difficult to manage because everyone's working remotely. So do you have any tips on how she can address that?
That's a really hard one, because at the moment, some people might be living on their own and not have a lot to do. And so work might be a welcome distraction almost for them than being at home isolated. I think as long as you have made it very, very clear that you don't expect actually we're global. And so I'm often doing weird hours, and I have asked somebody has said to me, "Oh, Gemma, is that expected of us? Because I see you're online all the time." And I said, absolutely not. And then followed it up with a very clear email communication around, just following up on our discussion. This is what I, expect from you, and I don't expect blah, 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 blah. So if you've made that very clear and you've emailed it and that person wants to work, I don't know if it's necessarily such a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, if I can offer a similar perspective too, like I'm a single mum, but I have my son half the time. So half the time I'm here alone. And I actually said on our team call the other day that sometimes when he's not here, I'm like, well, I've got stuff to do and I might as well do extra. Because I do part-time with Work 180 and the rest is my own business that's totally dried up because of there's no one's doing workshops now. And so I'm like, well, that's interesting. It's keeping me busy. Like otherwise I'm just watching Netflix. So Paula has asked another question, which is some of her managers, hi Paula, some of her managers have struggled to see the value of extracurricular virtual contact with their teams and everything is very formal. How can I encourage them to see it's a valuable part of productivity? That's such a good question. This is can I answer part of this question too, actually, because this is actually a lot of what I do outside of Work 180 is connecting teams and making them more productive. And all the research shows that people are the most productive when they actually connect with their team members, like they want to work with people and want to help them, and when they're working to their strengths. And without actually knowing their team on a more personal level, it's very hard to understand what their strengths are, because strengths goes much beyond just the stuff that you're doing at work. It's like a deep personality based thing. And so there's actually like a proven connection between connection with your team and productivity at work, because teams work much more cohesively together. But do either of you have something to add to that as well? Gemma or V?
Oh, yeah, I think there is a lot of research out there that maybe you could share and some articles, so it's not just coming from you, but it is such a, I know it seems like, you know, what's the point of doing this when it doesn't seem to be work related? People are not robots, you know, when they bond over something outside of work, it's just, it would increase productivity by, you know, there's so many articles that would actually quote numbers on that, that it's something that modern leadership demands essentially. So, you know, gone are the olden days of kind of what did they used to call it? Command and conquer, or rule with an iron fist and all that kind of stuff. It's it's very different.
I think the other thing is to, you know, getting to know people on a personal level. They're going to be more inclined to come to you when they're having challenges, and also come to you with feedback as well. And if you don't have that kind of relationship with your team, they're probably not going to tell you as much, and then the work is going to therefore suffer, because, you know, you're not going to understand potential problems that are going on. Because I think when V and I first started, you know, being a small business right at the beginning, I was just work. And I actually didn't have a lot of those personal connections with the team. And I found just huge amounts of benefits since doing that, getting to know people, understanding what their motivations are. They're happier when they come to work, you know, and they feel like, even if your manager actually like isn't that social, it's not about them. Like, it's about the team. So yeah, as V said, I can't think of anything off the top of my head in terms of stats, but I'm sure there would be a million in terms of, you know, personal engagement and the productivity benefits that come along with that.
It also makes giving tough feedback easier, and I can vouch for that. You know, even having performance conversations is so much easier if you've got that rapport, because it's very awkward to just go from, you know, business to, okay, now you've done this, you know, wrong or whatever, and I have to reprimand you. That's what it feels like. Otherwise, if you've got that relationship, you can actually have this conversation going, hey, you know, I feel that, you know, I'm not very, I don't know, whatever, supported in this area. And then that person might turn around and say, you know what, I'm sorry, I've dropped the ball, and here's what I'm going to do to fix that. And I'm telling you now, you would never have that conversation if you only have that strict formal relationship leading up till then. It's going to be very awkward. People will be very defensive. So yeah, that's another huge benefit that I've seen.
I have another couple of questions which have come through, not in the main chat. So one is, how do you keep the team working on day-to-day activities whilst getting ready for new priorities?
We have a lot of roadmaps, and they have to factor in BAU. So, you know, generally speaking, teams would have a pretty good grasp on how much time they spend on BAU versus, you know, how much new activity they can take on. Our tech teams is exceptionally good at that. And Jem, I don't know if you want to talk more on them, but they're a great example of really estimating well how much they'll produce each week, and then realizing how much spare time they have, and you know, really staying on track.
Yeah, that's right. And the only thing, I guess, maybe to add to that is also we use OKRs internally, so objectives and key results. And so you have what your main objectives are, to increase X revenue by X amount, to increase our NPS, for example, whatever it might be. That's the objective. And then the measures of that are the key result. So it might be increase NPS from 70 to 80, for example. That's the key result. And then you've got your priorities. So that's your kind of weekly tasks that get you towards that key result. And then the next 4 weeks of projects. So then that's the bit higher level view of that. So anyone who doesn't use OKRs at the moment, I definitely recommend that you read up on those. Valeria, what's that really good book?
Yes, it's by Christina, I think Wood. I'll find her details now and I'll paste it into the chat. I can't pronounce her surname, but it's an amazing book for anyone. And it will be intimidating if you're new to this. The first round, you will probably mess it all up, and that's very normal. But after that, it is amazing at how much, focus that can bring to your team's outputs.
I have another question that wasn't in the chat box, which is, what's the best way to manage difficult conversations remotely?
Just the same as you would in person. So you set up, you schedule a meeting and you have the conversation, except it's on video. So I would definitely recommend you don't do it over the phone or email or any other medium. Make it an in-person conversation over video. And everything else is just the same as you would normally follow. I'm not sure if there's a specific concern maybe that we can help address. Oh, there's another question from Rachel. Can we answer that one? Because we had that one in the Australian webinar as well, Rachel. So definitely you're not the only one where people are not keen to jump on video. Some of the strategies we discussed was making it not so much about them, but about, talking to that person and saying, hey, I need you to come on board because, there might be a few other people that are a bit camera shy, and getting them brought with you on the journey, so to speak, because ultimately, everybody needs to be on camera so that we can, build that sense of camaraderie as well. We really advocate, we actually say, unless you've got people, going berserk in the background, children or whatever, ensure that you're on camera at all times. So almost, lead by example, make it a rule. The other thing we did discuss though was with domestic family violence on the rise, due to, a number of things, increase stress levels, alcohol consumption and so on. There could be underlying reasons why that person might not want to be on camera. So it's about, again, having that good relationship and asking, even, go beyond, are you okay? Ask them, how is your mum? How are your grandparents? There's a lot of people being affected, by COVID-19 through their grandparents being in hospital or parents being hospitalized and so on. So, there could be things like that. There could be other things that are, triggering that reaction. So make sure you find out why. And if it's just people being stubborn, or maybe they're worried about their background, you can see that, Gemma and I have a fake background in the back. Maybe they don't have a professional corner in their house. So there's actually templates you can download in Zoom that, creates this background for you, so you can be professional. But there could be just like some really small reasons or a serious reason that you'll then obviously need to investigate further and see how you can support them.
I also have just quickly picked up the correct LinkedIn group. So it's LinkedIn/groups, and the number is 13616. I've just put it in the chat there. And as Gemma said, it's the UK network for professionals championing gender equality. So we'd love for you to join us in there. We do have really interesting conversations in all of our private groups on social media, and so it'd be great to have you in there joining that discussion. There are no additional questions that have come through. So if no one else has any other questions, we will leave it there. Like I said, you'll be receiving a follow-up with the blog from this and some of the links to things like Nucleino that people have asked about in Trello and Slack, things that we use, tools that we use and tools that we've mentioned on here, and a link to the UK LinkedIn page. So we'd love to see you in there. And we really hope that was useful as well. The other thing that will come out is a feedback form, just with a few questions, one of which is what are topics you would like to hear about. So we want this is to serve you and to be useful to you. And so we'd love to hear the things that you would like to hear more about from us. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. And Thank you very much.